Picture this. You are standing on the muddy banks of the Rhine River in 58 BC. The morning mist clings to the water like smoke from a funeral pyre. In the distance, you can hear the rhythmic pounding of Roman hobnailed boots against wet earth, the metallic clatter of chainmail, and the low rumble of wheels carrying siege engines toward another doomed settlement. You are witnessing the beginning of what historians would later call the Gallic Wars. But what you're really seeing is the systematic destruction of entire civilizations. And as the Roman legions advance, they're not just coming for the warriors and the treasures, they're coming for the women. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What I'm about to tell you has been deliberately omitted from the sanitized accounts of Roman conquest that dominate our textbooks. When Julius Caesar wrote his commentaries on the Gallic Wars, he focused on military tactics and political maneuvering. When later historians chronicled Rome's expansion across Europe, they celebrated engineering marvels and administrative efficiency. But they all conveniently ignored what happened when the fighting stopped and the real horror began. The truth is that Roman conquest wasn't just about defeating armies and seizing territory. It was about systematically breaking the spirit of entire peoples, and nothing broke that spirit more effectively than what they did to the women of the defeated tribes. Specifically, what they did to the wives of tribal chiefs, the queens and princesses who represented the sacred sovereignty of their nations. These weren't random acts of violence committed by undisciplined soldiers. This was policy. This was procedure. This was a carefully orchestrated system designed to humiliate, exploit, and ultimately erase the cultural identity of conquered peoples. And the women who suffered through it were not passive victims. Some of them found ways to fight back that would make your blood run cold. To understand the true scope of this systematic brutality, you need to understand how Roman military conquest actually worked. When a legion approached a tribal settlement, they weren't just coming to steal gold and burn buildings. They were implementing what modern scholars call total warfare, a strategy designed to destroy not just military resistance, but the very fabric of society itself. The process began with intelligence gathering. Roman scouts would spend weeks observing their targets, identifying key figures, mapping escape routes, and most importantly, cataloging the women of high status. They wanted to know which women were married to chiefs, which ones held religious authority, which ones had political influence. These women weren't just potential prisoners of war, they were strategic assets. When the attack finally came, it followed a predictable pattern. The Roman legions would surround the settlement before dawn, cutting off all escape routes. The assault would begin with a barrage of siege engines and flaming arrows, designed to create maximum chaos and terror. But here's the crucial detail that most histories gloss over. The Romans were under strict orders not to kill the high-value female targets. They needed them alive. As the settlement burned and the warriors fell, specialized teams of Roman soldiers would move through the chaos with specific assignments. They weren't looting randomly. They were executing a carefully planned operation to capture the wives, daughters, and sisters of the tribal leadership. These women would be dragged from burning buildings, pulled from hiding places, torn away from their dying husbands and children. The immediate aftermath of conquest was where the true horror began. While the surviving warriors were either executed or sold into slavery, the captured women were subjected to a sorting process that would determine their fate. Roman officers would examine each prisoner, assessing their value based on age, appearance, social status, and perceived usefulness. This wasn't casual evaluation. The Romans had developed a sophisticated classification system for female prisoners that operated like a twisted marketplace. At the bottom of the hierarchy were common women, the wives of farmers and craftsmen who would be sold in bulk to slave traders. Above them were skilled women, artisans and healers whose abilities made them more valuable. Higher still were noble women, the wives of warriors and minor chiefs who commanded premium prices. But at the very top of this horrific pyramid were the queens and princesses, the wives of tribal kings and high chiefs who represented the ultimate prize. These women faced a special category of abuse that was designed not just to exploit them individually, but to send a message to every conquered people about the complete powerlessness of their former rulers. The treatment of royal captives followed protocols that had been refined over decades of conquest. They would be stripped of all symbols of their former status, their jewelry confiscated, their ceremonial clothing torn away. They would be given Roman names that erased their tribal identities. They would be forced to perform public acts of submission that demonstrated their acceptance of Roman authority. But the psychological warfare went deeper than humiliation. These women were often the keepers of their tribe's sacred knowledge, the custodians of religious traditions that had existed for centuries. They knew the locations of hidden treasures, the identities of resistance networks, the secrets that could either help or hurt the Roman occupation. Extracting this information became a priority that shaped everything about how they were treated. The interrogation methods used on captured queens were sophisticated and brutal. Roman officers understood that torture alone was unreliable, that desperate people would say anything to stop the pain. Instead, they developed a system of psychological manipulation that combined threats, incentives, and calculated cruelty to break down resistance over time. They would separate these women from any other prisoners who might provide emotional support. They would use their children as leverage, threatening harm to sons and daughters unless cooperation was forthcoming. They would offer false hope of reunion or freedom while simultaneously demonstrating their absolute power through calculated displays of violence. What made this system particularly insidious was its sophistication. The Romans weren't mindless brutes destroying everything in their path. They were calculating administrators who understood exactly what they were doing and why. They knew that breaking the will of a tribal queen could demoralize an entire population more effectively than executing 1,000 warriors. The long-term fate of these women varied depending on their perceived value and the specific needs of their captors. Some were kept as permanent hostages, their continued existence serving as ongoing proof of Roman dominance. Others were given as gifts to important Roman citizens, becoming exotic trophies that demonstrated the giver's access to rare prizes. Many were assigned to what Roman records euphemistically called hospitality duties, a term that concealed systematic intimate abuse designed to maximize humiliation. They might serve dozens of officers over months or years, their royal status adding an extra dimension of degradation to what would otherwise be ordinary exploitation. The most valuable prisoners might be transported to Rome itself, where they would be displayed in triumphal processions that celebrated military victories. These parades were carefully choreographed spectacles designed to demonstrate Roman power, and captured queens walking in chains represented the ultimate symbol of barbarian submission. But here's where the story gets more complicated than simple victimization. Some of these women, faced with impossible circumstances, found ways to turn the system against itself. They learned to use their captors' assumptions and prejudices as weapons. They discovered that being underestimated could be an advantage, that appearing broken while secretly planning could create opportunities that didn't exist for open resistance. The Romans believed they were processing property, cataloging resources, managing assets. They didn't always recognize that they were dealing with intelligent, determined women who were learning their methods, studying their weaknesses, and waiting for chances to strike back. Some of these women would spend years pretending to be cooperative while secretly maintaining contact with resistance networks, passing information, and planning revenge. This is where our story truly begins, because what happened to one particular queen in the forests of northern Gaul would demonstrate just how dangerous these women could become when they decided to fight back using the very tools their captors had taught them. Her name was Karatica, and she was about to prove that the Romans had made a fatal miscalculation. She was the wife of Ambiorix, king of the Eburones, one of the most powerful tribes in northern Gaul. When Caesar's legions overran her settlement in the winter of 54 BC, she watched her husband escape into the deep forests while she was dragged away in chains. The Romans thought they had captured a trophy. What they had actually captured was a weapon that would take them 5 years to fully understand. Karatica was not like the other queens the Romans had processed. She had spent her youth traveling between tribal courts as part of diplomatic missions, learning languages, studying the customs of different peoples. She spoke fluent Latin, understood Roman military organization, and had observed their conquest methods in other territories. When she was brought before the legion commander, she didn't beg or threaten or remain silent like most captives. She negotiated. The Roman officer was Marcus Crassus, grandson of the wealthy general who had been killed by the Parthians. He was young, ambitious, and eager to prove himself worthy of his family name. When this barbarian queen began speaking perfect Latin and offering to trade information for better treatment, he saw an opportunity to extract intelligence that could advance his career. Karatica told him about hidden weapons caches that didn't exist. She revealed the locations of tribal meeting places that had been abandoned months earlier. She provided names of resistance leaders who were already dead or had fled beyond Roman reach. Every piece of information was carefully crafted to seem valuable, while actually being worthless, designed to waste Roman time and resources, while appearing to demonstrate her cooperation. But the real genius of her strategy was subtler than simple misdirection. While feeding Crassus useless intelligence, she was learning everything about Roman operational procedures, communication methods, and administrative weaknesses. She memorized patrol schedules, identified which officers could be bribed, and mapped the informal networks of information that flowed through the camp. Crassus, believing he had turned a valuable asset, gave Karatica privileges that other prisoners didn't receive. She was housed in a tent near the command area rather than in the general prisoner compound. She was allowed to attend planning meetings as a translator and advisor. She was given access to maps, documents, and conversations that revealed Roman strategy across the entire region. For 3 months, she played this role perfectly. She advised on tribal customs when the Romans were negotiating with other chiefs. She translated captured documents written in Celtic scripts. She provided cultural insights that helped Roman diplomats navigate complex political situations, all while secretly cataloguing everything she learned about Roman methods and vulnerabilities. The breakthrough came when she discovered that Roman communication networks relied heavily on local messengers who moved between camps carrying written orders. These messengers were often Gallic collaborators who had been promised rewards for their service. Karatica realized that if she could identify these collaborators and feed false information into their network, she could manipulate Roman decision-making from the inside. She began by identifying a messenger named Lucius, who regularly carried dispatches between Crassus and other commanders in the region. Lucius was a Gaul who had adopted a Roman name and Roman customs, believing that collaboration would secure his family's safety. Karatica approached him carefully, claiming she had information about a planned ambush that threatened his usual route. The information was fabricated, but it was detailed enough to seem credible. Karatica described specific locations, named supposed conspirators, and provided a timeline that would require immediate action. Lucius, believing he was receiving intelligence from a trusted Roman asset, carried this information to other camps where it triggered unnecessary defensive preparations and troop movements. This was the beginning of what military historians would later call the Phantom Rebellion. Over the following months, Karatica fed false intelligence about uprising plots, ambush plans, and resistance activities into the Roman communication network. Each fabricated threat seemed credible because it came from a source that Roman officers trusted completely. The psychological impact on Roman forces was devastating. Commanders became increasingly paranoid, seeing threats everywhere. Troops were constantly being redeployed to counter imaginary dangers. Supply lines were rerouted to avoid non-existent ambush sites. The efficient Roman machine began to grind against itself, consuming resources and energy fighting shadows. But Karatica's masterpiece was yet to come. She had been carefully observing the personal dynamics between Roman officers, noting their rivalries, ambitions, and insecurities. She realized that the competitive nature of Roman military culture could be weaponized against itself if she could create the right conditions. The opportunity arose when two of Crassus's subordinates, Tribune Gaius Volcasius and Centurion Marcus Petreius, developed a bitter dispute over credit for a recent victory against a minor tribe. Both men were ambitious, both believed they deserved promotion, and both were willing to undermine their rival to advance their careers. Karatica began feeding each man information that suggested the other was plotting against him. She told Volcasius that Petreius was claiming credit for intelligence that had actually come from her, implying that Petreius was trying to steal glory that belonged to Volcasius. She told Petreius that Volcasius was questioning his competence in private meetings with Crassus. Neither accusation was true, but both were plausible enough to inflame existing tensions. The two officers began actively working against each other, withholding information, contradicting each other's recommendations, and generally poisoning the command structure with their rivalry. As the situation deteriorated, Karatica escalated her manipulation. She arranged for forged documents to be discovered that suggested one of the officers was in secret communication with Gallic resistance fighters. The documents were crude forgeries that wouldn't survive serious scrutiny, but they were convincing enough to create immediate suspicion and paranoia. The Roman command structure began to collapse under the weight of manufactured distrust. Officers questioned each other's loyalty. Information flow broke down as commanders hesitated to share intelligence with colleagues they suspected of treachery. Decision-making became paralyzed as every proposal was viewed through the lens of potential conspiracy. Meanwhile, Karatica had established secret contact with her husband Ambiorix, who was still operating in the forests with a small band of warriors. Through a network of sympathizers, she was able to pass real intelligence about Roman troop movements, supply schedules, and defensive weaknesses to the actual resistance. The contrast was striking. While Roman forces were chasing phantom threats based on Karatica's false intelligence, real Gallic fighters were using accurate information she provided to launch devastating raids against vulnerable targets. Roman supply convoys disappeared without explanation. Isolated outposts were attacked with precision that suggested inside knowledge of their routines. Crassus, still believing that Karatica was his most valuable intelligence asset, consulted with her about these mysterious attacks. She expressed concern about the security breaches, suggested possible explanations for how the information was leaking, and recommended defensive measures that actually made Roman positions more vulnerable to the raids she was helping to plan. The psychological warfare reached its climax during the winter of 53 BC, when Karatica convinced Crassus that a massive tribal alliance was forming to launch a coordinated spring offensive against Roman forces. The intelligence was detailed, naming specific tribes, identifying supposed meeting locations, and describing military preparations that required immediate Roman response. Crassus, terrified of being caught unprepared for such an assault, requested massive reinforcements from Caesar and began concentrating his forces in defensive positions. This troop movement left large areas of territory temporarily undefended, creating opportunities for real resistance activities that had nothing to do with the imaginary alliance Karatica had described. The irony was perfect. Roman forces were preparing to defend against a threat that didn't exist, while real threats exploited the vulnerabilities that preparation had created. Karatica had turned Roman military efficiency into a weapon against itself, using their own competence and caution to create the conditions for their defeat.
Oh.
But perhaps the most devastating aspect of her strategy was its sustainability. Unlike a conventional military attack that could be defeated or repelled, Karatica's psychological warfare was self-reinforcing. Each false alarm made Roman commanders more paranoid. Each mysterious raid made them more suspicious of their own intelligence sources. Each defensive measure based on fabricated intelligence created new vulnerabilities for real attacks to exploit. The Romans were trapped in a cycle where their responses to imaginary threats created actual threats, while their attempts to address actual threats were undermined by their paranoid responses to imaginary ones. They were fighting a war against their own assumptions and losing badly. By the spring of 52 BC, the situation had become so chaotic that Caesar himself was forced to intervene directly. The region that should have been pacified was in open revolt. Roman supply lines were under constant attack, and the command structure was paralyzed by suspicion and infighting. Caesar arrived to find his officers more afraid of each other than they were of the Gallic resistance. Communication had broken down so completely that some units were operating in complete isolation, afraid to trust orders that might come from compromised sources. The efficient Roman war machine had been reduced to a collection of terrified, isolated fragments. The investigation that followed revealed the scope of Karatica's deception, but by then it was too late to undo the damage. The Phantom Rebellion had become a real rebellion. The imaginary threats had inspired actual resistance. The psychological warfare had achieved something that conventional military action never could have accomplished. When Caesar finally uncovered the extent of Karatica's manipulation, his reaction was not the rage you might expect from a general who had been outmaneuvered by a barbarian prisoner. Instead, according to his own accounts, he experienced something close to admiration. He had spent years perfecting the art of psychological warfare against tribal peoples, and here was a woman who had turned his own methods against him with devastating effectiveness. The interrogation of Karatica revealed the true scope of her operation. For over 2 years, she had been the invisible hand guiding Roman decision-making across an entire region. Every major troop movement, every defensive preparation, every strategic decision had been influenced by intelligence that originated from her carefully crafted deceptions. She had turned the Roman war machine into her personal weapon. But Caesar's investigation also revealed something else, something that would change Roman policy toward captured queens forever. Karatica was not unique. Across Gaul, other captured women of high status were conducting similar operations on smaller scales. The systematic processing of tribal wives and daughters had created an entire network of embedded enemies operating from within Roman command structures. In the settlement of the Treveri, a captured priestess named Veleda had convinced her Roman captors that she possessed prophetic abilities. For months, she provided predictions about tribal movements and weather patterns that proved remarkably accurate. What the Romans didn't realize was that her prophecies were based on intelligence she received from resistance networks, while her presence in the command tent allowed her to gather information that she passed back to those same networks. Among the Nervi, the widow of a fallen chief had spent 3 years serving as a cultural advisor to Roman administrators. She helped them understand tribal customs, mediate disputes, and negotiate with local leaders, all while secretly coordinating a resistance movement that used her insider knowledge of Roman procedures to stay one step ahead of every attempt at suppression. The pattern was consistent across conquered territories. Women who appeared broken and cooperative were actually conducting sophisticated intelligence operations. They used their captors' assumptions about barbarian inferiority and female helplessness as camouflage for activities that would have impressed professional spies. Caesar realized that the Roman system for processing captured women had a fundamental flaw. By placing high-value prisoners in positions where they could observe Roman operations, the legions had inadvertently created a network of enemy agents embedded within their own command structures. Every captured queen who appeared to cooperate was potentially gathering intelligence, manipulating decisions, or coordinating resistance activities. The solution Caesar implemented was characteristically brutal and efficient. New protocols were established for handling captured tribal royalty. Instead of attempting to extract cooperation through incentives and privileges, the Romans would now assume that every captured queen was a potential threat, regardless of her apparent willingness to collaborate. High-status female prisoners would be kept in complete isolation, with no access to Roman operational information. They would be interrogated using methods specifically designed to break psychological resistance quickly and completely. Those who provided useful intelligence would be eliminated immediately after verification to prevent them from becoming ongoing security risks. The new system was tested first on Karatica herself. Caesar ordered her transfer to a secure facility near Rome, where specialists in extracting information from difficult prisoners could work without the time pressures of active campaign conditions. What happened during those interrogations was never fully recorded, but the techniques developed during that process would become standard procedure for handling captured tribal leadership. The psychological impact on other captured women was immediate and devastating. Word of the new protocols spread through resistance networks, and the knowledge that cooperation no longer guaranteed survival fundamentally changed the dynamics of capture and interrogation. Some women chose death over capture. Others revealed everything immediately, hoping that complete honesty might earn better treatment. But perhaps most importantly, the revelation of how effectively these women had manipulated Roman operations sparked changes in military culture that went far beyond prisoner handling. Roman officers began to question their assumptions about barbarian intelligence and capabilities. The comfortable superiority that had characterized Roman attitudes toward conquered peoples was replaced by a more cautious respect for their potential sophistication. Training programs were developed to help Roman administrators recognize signs of manipulation and deception. New security procedures were implemented to limit access to sensitive information. Communication protocols were redesigned to prevent the kind of systematic intelligence gathering that Karatica had conducted. The irony was that these defensive measures, while protecting against future manipulation, also reduced Roman administrative efficiency. The casual access to information that had allowed Roman officers to make quick decisions was replaced by compartmentalized systems that slowed down response times and complicated coordination between units. In some ways, Karatica's psychological warfare had achieved a victory that outlasted her own capture. Even after her network was exposed and dismantled, the Romans remained permanently changed by the experience of being systematically deceived by someone they had considered property rather than threat. The broader implications extended beyond military operations to Roman attitudes toward conquered populations in general. The comfortable assumption that barbarian peoples were inherently inferior and therefore manageable was replaced by a more paranoid awareness that resistance could take forms that were difficult to detect and counter. This shift in Roman thinking had consequences that rippled through the empire for generations. Colonial administrators became more suspicious of local collaborators. Military commanders were less willing to trust intelligence from captured sources. The efficient system of cultural integration that had previously characterized Roman expansion was replaced by more brutal methods of control that assumed permanent hostility from conquered populations. But the story of captured tribal queens was far from over. While Karatica's network had been exposed and destroyed, her methods had been observed and learned by others. The techniques she had developed for manipulating Roman decision-making were refined and adapted by resistance movements throughout the empire. In Britain, when the Romans conquered the Iceni tribe, Queen Boudica would use psychological warfare methods remarkably similar to those Karatica had pioneered. The systematic humiliation inflicted on Boudica and her daughters was intended to break resistance. but it actually provided her with intimate knowledge of Roman vulnerabilities that she would later exploit during her famous rebellion. The pattern repeated across the empire. Each brutal suppression of tribal leadership created new enemies who combined intimate knowledge of Roman methods with burning motivation for revenge. The wives and daughters of defeated chiefs became repositories of strategic intelligence that resistance movements could access when conditions allowed for rebellion. Roman historians, writing decades after these events, would largely omit the role these women played in undermining imperial expansion. The official accounts focused on military victories, administrative achievements, and the civilizing influence of Roman culture. They did not record the systematic intelligence operations conducted by women who were supposed to be broken trophies of conquest. The silence was deliberate, acknowledging that barbarian women had successfully manipulated Roman military operations would undermine the narrative of inherent Roman superiority that justified the empire's existence. It was easier to attribute military setbacks to environmental factors, supply problems, or the exceptional ferocity of particular tribes than to admit systematic deception by people considered intellectually inferior. But the archaeological evidence tells a different story. Excavations at Roman military sites throughout Gaul have revealed security modifications that can only be explained by awareness of sophisticated intelligence gathering by hostile forces. Communication systems were redesigned. Access controls were implemented. Information handling procedures were compartmentalized in ways that suggest systematic penetration had been detected and countered. The material culture also reveals changes in how captured women were housed and supervised. Earlier Roman camps had relatively open prisoner compounds where high-value captives could observe daily operations. Later sites show isolated holding facilities designed to prevent any observation of military activities. The architecture itself documents the learning curve forced on Roman commanders by women like Karatica. Perhaps most tellingly, Roman legal documents from the period show increasing emphasis on loyalty oaths and security screening for local collaborators. The casual trust that had previously characterized Roman relationships with cooperative barbarians was replaced by elaborate verification procedures designed to detect potential deception. These changes represented a fundamental shift in how Romans understood conquest and control. The early imperial period had been characterized by confidence that superior civilization would naturally attract the loyalty of conquered peoples. The later period showed awareness that resistance could take sophisticated forms that required sophisticated countermeasures. The women who forced this evolution in Roman thinking paid a terrible price for their resistance. Most died under interrogation or were executed when their activities were discovered. Their names were deliberately erased from official records. Their achievements were attributed to male leaders or dismissed as lucky accidents. But their impact on Roman imperial culture was permanent and profound. They had demonstrated that conquest was never as complete as it appeared, that resistance could take forms that were invisible until they achieved devastating results, and that the people Rome considered property were actually dangerous enemies capable of turning Roman strengths into Roman weaknesses. The legacy of their psychological warfare would influence resistance movements for centuries. The techniques Karatica developed for manipulating information, flow, and exploiting organizational rivalries would be refined and adapted by rebels throughout the empire. The basic insight that occupying forces could be turned against themselves through careful manipulation of their own procedures became a cornerstone of asymmetric warfare, metric warfare. The psychological scars left by these operations would manifest in ways that Roman administrators never anticipated. By the time Caesar's campaigns in Gaul were drawing to a close, the empire had created something unprecedented in military history. A generation of women who understood Roman systems better than most Roman officers, who had been trained through suffering to recognize every weakness in imperial administration, and who carried within themselves a burning hatred that would never be extinguished. These women didn't simply disappear when their immediate usefulness ended. they became the mothers of the next generation of resistance leaders. They raised sons and daughters who grew up hearing detailed accounts of Roman methods, Roman vulnerabilities, and Roman hypocrisy. Children who learned from birth that collaboration was betrayal and that patience was the most powerful weapon against an occupying force. The compound effect was devastating. Each brutal suppression of tribal leadership created new repositories of strategic knowledge that would be passed down through family lines for generations. Roman conquest, which was supposed to break the cultural transmission that sustained barbarian resistance, actually created more sophisticated and better informed resistance networks than had ever existed before. Consider what happened in the aftermath of the Gallic Wars. The wives and daughters who had survived Roman processing were scattered throughout the empire as slaves, servants, and discarded property. But they maintained contact with each other through networks that Roman authorities never detected. They shared information about Roman weaknesses, coordinated small acts of sabotage, and identified opportunities for larger resistance operations. A captured Helvetii princess named Augatorix worked as a household slave in a Roman villa near Massilia for 12 years. Her Roman master considered her completely pacified, a model of successful cultural integration. She spoke perfect Latin, observed Roman customs, and showed no signs of harboring resentment about her changed circumstances. What he didn't know was that she was maintaining detailed records of Roman troop movements, supply routes, and administrative procedures. Every merchant who visited the villa, every official who conducted business there, every conversation she overheard while serving wine was carefully catalogued and analysed. She memorized the names of corrupt officials who could be bribed, identified Roman citizens who expressed doubts about imperial policies, and mapped the informal networks of communication that connected Roman settlements throughout southern Gaul. When the opportunity finally arose, during a period of political instability that followed Caesar's assassination, Augatorix used this intelligence to coordinate a rebellion that nearly succeeded in driving Roman forces out of the region entirely. The uprising was eventually suppressed, but only after Roman authorities realized they were facing an enemy who knew their systems better than they knew them themselves. The pattern repeated throughout the empire, with variations that reflected local conditions and opportunities. In Spain, the widow of a Celtiberian chief spent 15 years as a temple servant in Taraco, all while coordinating intelligence networks that supported continuing resistance in the mountainous interior. In Illyria, a captured tribal priestess worked as a translator for Roman administrators, using her position to feed false information that misdirected military operations for over a decade. What made these operations so effective was their invisibility. Roman administrators had been trained to watch for conventional signs of rebellion: weapons caches, secret meetings, inflammatory speeches, organized military resistance. They were not prepared to recognize intelligence gathering disguised as domestic service, or coordination networks disguised as social relationships between enslaved women. The Romans had created their own blind spot. Their assumptions about female helplessness and barbarian inferiority made it impossible for them to see the sophisticated operations being conducted right under their noses. Women who appeared broken and compliant were actually the most dangerous enemies the empire faced, precisely because their danger was unrecognizable within Roman cultural frameworks. This blindness extended to the highest levels of imperial administration. When Augustus established the Praetorian Guard to protect the emperor from assassination, the screening procedures focused entirely on identifying male threats. No one considered that the greatest danger might come from women who had spent years learning Roman security procedures while serving as household staff in the homes of important officials. The oversight was nearly fatal. In 19 AD, a plot to assassinate Augustus was discovered just days before execution. The conspiracy had been organized by 3 women: a former Gallic queen who worked as a servant in the imperial palace, a Germanic priestess who served as a translator for diplomatic missions, and a British noble who had been given as a gift to Augustus's wife Livia. Their plan was sophisticated, well coordinated, and came terrifyingly close to success. Investigation that followed revealed the scope of intelligence networks that these women had been operating within the highest levels of Roman government. They had detailed knowledge of the emperor's daily routines, his security arrangements, his personal relationships, and his political vulnerabilities. They knew which guards could be bribed, which officials could be blackmailed, and which allies might be turned against him under the right circumstances. More disturbing still, the investigation revealed that similar networks existed throughout the imperial administration. Women who had been processed as conquered property decades earlier were now embedded in positions that gave them access to the most sensitive information in the empire. They served in the households of senators, generals, and provincial governors. They worked as servants, concubines, and cultural advisors to the men who made decisions about imperial policy. The security review that Augustus ordered in response to this discovery found evidence of systematic intelligence gathering in every major city of the empire. Captured tribal women were maintaining detailed records of Roman military capabilities, economic resources, and political divisions. They were identifying potential allies among disaffected Roman citizens and coordinating with resistance movements in unconquered territories beyond the imperial borders. The scope of the infiltration was so extensive that completely eliminating it would have required purging thousands of household servants, administrative assistants, and cultural specialists throughout the empire. Such an action would have paralyzed the imperial bureaucracy and created massive economic disruption. Instead, Augustus chose a different approach. The story of what Romans did to the wives of defeated tribal chiefs reveals a truth that history has tried to bury for 2,000 years. These women were not just victims of conquest, they were architects of resistance who turned the weapons of empire against itself. They proved that no system of oppression is perfect, that intelligence and determination can find cracks in any foundation, and that those who appear most powerless may actually pose the greatest threat. Remember their names when you can find them. Remember their methods when the records survive. Remember that conquest is never as complete as the conquerors believe, and that the price of underestimating your enemies is always higher than you think you can afford to pay.